He was mad my coworker dropped me home at 5 a.m., so I told him to grow up, and he left me. I need to get this off my chest because everyone's acting like I'm some kind of monster. And honestly, I'm tired of pretending I care what they think anymore. My name is Sophie, and I'm 28. My relationship with Ethan just imploded, but not for the reasons everyone thinks they know. Ethan and I have been together for 4 years, living together for the past 2 years in this cramped apartment in Riverdale that smells like his gym clothes no matter how much I clean. Everyone thinks he's such a catch, stable job, pays most of the bills, doesn't go out drinking with his buddies every weekend. But living with someone day in and day out, you see who they really are. And Ethan became predictable in the worst way possible. I work in the same office complex as Lucas, just different floors. We started talking maybe 8 months ago in the elevator, then grabbing coffee in the lobby, and eventually having lunch together when our schedules lined up. Lucas actually listens when I talk about my day, asks follow-up questions, remembers things I mentioned weeks ago. Meanwhile, Ethan comes home and immediately turns on some gaming stream while I'm trying to tell him about my day. When I point this out, he gets defensive and says he's decompressing from work. Here's what kills me about Ethan. He expects me to text him constantly throughout the day, gets pouty if I don't respond within an hour, but then he'll leave me on read for hours when he's busy. When I call him out on this double standard, he acts like I'm being unreasonable. I started leaving his messages unread sometimes, just to see how it felt, and suddenly he's all concerned about communication in our relationship. Lucas began offering me rides home when Ethan was working late, which has been happening more often lately. Ethan claims he's trying to get promoted, but honestly, I think he just prefers being at work to being home with me. During those car rides, Lucas and I would talk about everything: music, movies, our frustrations with work, our dreams. Real conversations, not just "how was your day?" followed by grunting while staring at a screen. I started noticing how Lucas made me laugh in ways I hadn't in months. He'd remember little things about me that Ethan had completely forgotten, like how I hate the radio commercials in the morning, so Lucas would always have a playlist ready, or how I mentioned once that I missed dancing. And he'd find excuses to talk about concerts and clubs we should check out sometime. Ethan started asking more questions about my work friends, specifically Lucas. He'd casually ask what we talked about during lunch or why I was getting home later on the days Lucas drove me. I found this suffocating and controlling, like I'm not allowed to have friends now. Meanwhile, Ethan hangs out with his coworker Olivia all the time, goes to her housewarming parties, texts her about work stuff on weekends. But when I point out this hypocrisy, he says it's different because Olivia is married. I'll admit I started checking Ethan's phone when he was in the shower, but only because his sudden interest in my friendships made me suspicious about his own. What I found was boring work conversations and gaming group chats, which somehow made me even more frustrated. At least if he was cheating, it would explain why our relationship felt so stale. When Lucas mentioned his friend was throwing a party last weekend, I was genuinely excited for the first time in months. Ethan asked about it in that careful way he does when he's trying not to sound controlling, so I told him it was just a casual work thing. I didn't mention that Lucas was picking me up because I knew Ethan would make it weird. Why should I have to justify every detail of my social life to someone who barely engages with me at home? The night of the party, I spent extra time getting ready, choosing an outfit that made me feel confident and attractive, feelings I'd almost forgotten I could have. When Lucas picked me up, he complimented how I looked, and I realized Ethan hadn't said anything nice about my appearance in weeks. Lucas and I talked and laughed during the drive, and I felt like I was remembering who I used to be before I became half of a couple that barely talked to each other. I told Ethan the party was casual, but it was actually pretty upscale. I didn't want him to feel left out or awkward. And honestly, I wanted one night where I could just be myself without worrying about managing his social anxiety or making sure he was having a good time. Is that so wrong? For 4 years, I've been accommodating his moods and preferences, making sure he's comfortable in social situations, and I was exhausted from always being the one who had to adjust. Lucas introduced me to his friends as his brilliant coworker, and they actually seemed interested in talking to me, asking about my work and opinions on things. When was the last time Ethan introduced me as anything other than his girlfriend? These people made me feel interesting and valued in ways I'd forgotten were possible. I found myself laughing more than I had in months, feeling attractive and appreciated. As the party went on, Lucas and I ended up talking alone on the balcony about our frustrations with our current situations. I found myself opening up about feeling taken for granted, about missing the excitement and passion that used to be in my relationship. Lucas listened without judgment, shared some of his own relationship struggles from the past, and made me feel understood in a way Ethan hadn't in a long time. When someone mentioned an after-party at Lucas's place, I said yes, without even thinking about Ethan waiting at home. I was having fun, feeling alive again, and I didn't want the night to end. I justified it by telling myself Ethan would just worry unnecessarily, and what he didn't know wouldn't hurt him. Besides, he'd probably just fallen asleep on the couch waiting for me anyway, like he usually did on weekend nights. The truth is, being around Lucas reminded me of who I used to be before I settled into this comfortable but suffocating routine with Ethan. I wasn't ready to go back to that cramped apartment and pretend everything was fine when I was finally feeling like myself again. Lucas made me feel special and desired, emotions that had been missing from my life for longer than I cared to admit. At Lucas's apartment, the group was smaller and more intimate. We ended up in deep conversations about our dreams, our frustrations with work, and yes, our relationships. I found myself being honest about feeling trapped and unappreciated, about missing the excitement of being with someone who actually seemed interested in me as a person rather than just as a comfortable routine. Lucas was incredibly understanding and supportive, validating feelings I'd been questioning myself. He talked about how relationships can become stagnant when people stop making effort, how easy it is to take someone for granted when you see them every day. His perspective made me realize that maybe the problems in my relationship with Ethan weren't all in my head, like Ethan kept suggesting. I'd turned off my read receipts and was ignoring Ethan's increasingly frequent texts because I knew he was probably spiraling into one of his paranoid episodes. The last thing I wanted was him ruining my first good night in months with his insecurity and neediness. I was finally having adult conversations with interesting people, and I wasn't about to let Ethan's anxiety disorder dictate my social life. Between us, I'd been feeling emotionally starved for months. Ethan had become so predictable and comfortable that he'd stopped trying to impress me or even really see me. We'd fallen into this roommate routine where we split bills and occasionally watched Netflix together, but there was no passion, no excitement, no real connection anymore. Being with Lucas reminded me what it felt like to have someone actually pay attention to me. As the night went on and people started leaving, I found myself alone with Lucas, and our conversation became even more personal and intense. He talked about how he could see I was unhappy, how someone like me deserved to feel appreciated and desired. For the first time in months, I felt truly seen and understood by someone who actually cared about my feelings and thoughts. The emotional intimacy was intoxicating after months of surface-level interactions with Ethan. Lucas made me feel intelligent, attractive, and valued in ways that Ethan had stopped doing long ago. We talked until the early morning hours, and I felt more connected to another human being than I had in my entire relationship with Ethan. This wasn't just about being unhappy at home. This was about remembering what it felt like to truly connect with someone who appreciated me. Looking back, I can see that what happened next was inevitable. When you're emotionally starved and someone finally gives you the attention and validation you've been craving, it's hard to think clearly about consequences. The connection Lucas and I had built over months of friendship had evolved into something deeper. And that night, It became something more physical too. I'm not going to lie and say I was too drunk to know what I was doing or that it just happened without any conscious choice on my part. But I will say that it felt like the natural progression of an emotional connection that had been building for months, while my relationship with Ethan deteriorated into boring routine and constant criticism of my social life. What happened between Lucas and me felt right in the moment because it was based on genuine connection, understanding, and mutual attraction. It wasn't some random hookup or moment of weakness. It was the culmination of finding someone who actually saw and appreciated me for who I am rather than taking me for granted like Ethan had been doing for months. The guilt I felt afterward wasn't about betraying Ethan specifically, but about the complexity of the situation. I knew this would hurt him, but I also knew that our relationship had been dying a slow death for months, and neither of us had been brave enough to address it directly. In some ways, what happened with Lucas just brought the existing problems to the surface. I found myself thinking that maybe this was exactly what I needed to finally end a relationship that had become more habit than love. Ethan and I had been going through the motions for so long that I'd forgotten what it felt like to be genuinely excited about someone. Lucas reminded me that I deserved more than comfortable routine and someone who made me feel like my social life was a threat to our relationship. When morning came, Lucas offered to drive me home, which led to another hour of conversation in his car outside my apartment building. We made plans to meet for lunch during the week, and I found myself looking forward to it in a way I hadn't looked forward to anything in months. This wasn't about hurting Ethan. This was about finally finding someone who made me feel alive again. As Lucas dropped me off at 6:17 a.m., I saw Ethan waiting by the window. And instead of feeling guilty, I felt annoyed. Here he was, spying on me like I was some kind of criminal instead of trusting me to manage my own social life. This was exactly the kind of controlling behavior that had been pushing me away for months. Walking into the house, I immediately went on the offensive because I was tired of being treated like a child who couldn't be trusted to have friends and a social life. Instead of Ethan asking if I had a good time or showing any interest in my evening, his first response was suspicion and accusations. This confirmed everything I'd been feeling about how suffocating our relationship had become. When Ethan started questioning me about the party and why I was so late, I made it clear that I wasn't going to be interrogated like some teenager coming home past curfew. I'm a grown woman who should be able to have friends and attend social events without having to provide a detailed itinerary to my boyfriend. His paranoia and need to control my social life had become unbearable. I used the tears strategically when Ethan started pressing for details because I knew they would make him feel guilty for not trusting me. Why should I have to defend my right to have friends and attend parties? The fact that he was more focused on his own insecurity than on whether I had enjoyed myself told me everything I needed to know about our relationship priorities. When Ethan asked direct questions about Lucas, I made him feel crazy for being suspicious of a work friendship. I pointed out how paranoid and controlling he was being, how his jealousy was destroying our relationship, and how exhausting it was to constantly reassure him about every male friend I had. This wasn't about what happened with Lucas. This was about Ethan's inability to trust me and his need to control every aspect of my life. I brought up every time Ethan had disappointed me, every time he'd chosen work or gaming over spending time with me, every way he'd taken me for granted over the past year. If he was going to attack my character and my friendships, then he needed to hear about his own shortcomings as a partner. I wasn't going to let him make me the villain when he'd been emotionally absent for months. When Ethan demanded that I cut contact with Lucas, I refused because that would be letting him win. I wasn't going to give up the one friendship that made me feel valued and appreciated just because Ethan was too insecure to handle me having male friends. His ultimatum proved that this was about control, not about love or concern for our relationship. The fight escalated when Ethan mentioned seeing Lucas's car, and I attacked his need to spy on me rather than addressing his concerns. Why was he watching out the window like some kind of stalker instead of trusting me to manage my own social life? This level of surveillance was exactly why our relationship felt suffocating and why I needed friends who treated me like an independent adult. I told Ethan he was being dramatic and insecure, that his jealousy was the real problem in our relationship. I'd been walking on eggshells for months, trying not to trigger his paranoia about my friendships, and I was done accommodating his emotional issues. If he couldn't trust me to have friends and a social life, then maybe we weren't compatible after all. When Ethan finally told me he was done and that I needed to move out, I honestly thought he was bluffing. He'd made empty threats before when he was upset, and I figured this was just another attempt to control me through emotional manipulation. I told him he was being ridiculous, and that he'd calm down once he stopped being so paranoid about my friendships. But Ethan started making concrete plans for our separation, changing passwords, talking to the landlord about the lease, and suddenly I realized he was serious. Instead of recognizing this as a consequence of my choices, I blamed him for giving up on our relationship without trying to work through our problems. He was abandoning 4 years together because he couldn't handle me having friends. In the weeks that followed, I discovered that Lucas wasn't as invested in developing our relationship as I thought he would be. When I tried to spend more time with him outside of work, he seemed less available and interested. Eventually, he casually mentioned that he'd started seeing someone else, like our connection hadn't meant anything significant to him. The realization that I'd thrown away my stable relationship for someone who was just enjoying the attention and excitement of the situation was devastating. But even then, I couldn't fully accept that this was my fault. I'd been lied to and used by Lucas, who had led me to believe our connection was more meaningful than it actually was. I struggled with the practical realities of living alone, managing all the bills myself, and dealing with the social fallout of my choices. Friends started taking sides, and many of them seemed to think Ethan was the victim in this situation. They didn't understand how suffocating and controlling he'd become or how emotionally neglected I'd been feeling for months. Ethan moved on with someone new pretty quickly, some woman from his workplace who probably appreciates his boring stability and doesn't mind being controlled. Seeing them together at social events was painful, but not because I missed him. It was frustrating to watch him be happy with someone else when he'd made me feel so unappreciated and trapped. My work environment became uncomfortable as word spread about the situation with Lucas. People started treating me differently, like I was some kind of drama creator, when all I'd done was try to find genuine connection and friendship with a coworker. The whole situation affected my professional relationships in ways that felt completely unfair. Looking back, I still maintain that the real problem was Ethan's inability to trust me and his need to control my social life. If he'd been more secure and supportive of my friendships, none of this would have happened. I needed someone who could appreciate my independence and social nature, not someone who saw my friendships as threats to our relationship. Everyone wants to paint me as the villain in this story, but they don't understand what it's like to feel emotionally suffocated and taken for granted for months. I deserve to feel valued and appreciated. And if Ethan couldn't provide that, then someone else would. I'm not going to apologize for wanting more than a boring routine relationship with someone who treated me like a roommate instead of a partner. The worst part is how everyone acts like Ethan is some kind of saint now. They see him with his new girlfriend and think he's moved on to something better, but they don't know what he was really like behind closed doors. They don't know about his passive-aggressive comments, his emotional manipulation when things didn't go his way, or how he used to sulk for days when I wanted to spend time with friends. His new girlfriend seems perfectly content being controlled and monitored. And, honestly, good for them. She's probably one of those women who thinks it's romantic when a guy gets jealous and possessive. She'll figure out eventually that his protectiveness is actually just insecurity dressed up as love. I give it 8 months before she starts feeling suffocated too. What really bothers me is how my family has reacted to all this. My mom keeps asking when I'm going to settle down again and finds ways to bring up how nice Ethan was, like I should have been grateful for bare minimum relationship effort. My sister acts like I threw away my chance at happiness, but she's been married to the same boring guy for 10 years and barely seems happy herself. The financial stress of living alone has been challenging, but it's also been liberating in ways I didn't expect. I don't have to justify my purchases or explain why I want to upgrade my phone or buy clothes that make me feel good. Ethan used to make passive-aggressive comments about my spending while conveniently forgetting that I contributed to household expenses too. I've started going out more, meeting new people, and remembering what it's like to have conversations that don't revolve around work schedules and household chores. The dating apps have been interesting. Men actually seem excited to talk to me and ask me questions about myself. It's refreshing after years of being taken for granted by someone who acted like my presence in his life was guaranteed. Some of my coworkers have been supportive, recognizing that workplace friendships are normal and that what happened with Lucas doesn't make me some kind of predatory homewrecker. The ones who judge me are probably jealous that I had the courage to leave a stagnant relationship instead of settling for mediocrity like they have. Lucas and I don't talk much anymore, but that's probably for the best, given how complicated the workplace dynamics became. I don't regret our connection because it reminded me what genuine attraction and emotional compatibility feel like. If anything, I'm grateful he showed me that I was settling for far less than I deserved. The truth is, Ethan and I were incompatible in fundamental ways that would have ended our relationship eventually anyway. I just happened to find someone who made me realize what I was missing before Ethan figured it out himself. Everyone can judge me if they want, but I know I deserve better than what I was settling for. And I'm not going to pretend otherwise just to make other people comfortable. Looking forward, I'm focusing on rebuilding my life according to my own values and priorities instead of constantly accommodating someone else's insecurities and limitations. Maybe I'll find someone who actually appreciates my independence and social nature. Or maybe I'll stay single and enjoy the freedom that comes with not having to manage another person's emotional baggage every day.